It's a story of manipulation, control, and unimaginable horror. A couple that should have been partners in love and life instead became partners in some of the most heinous crimes in British history. Their crimes went undetected for decades, leaving behind a wake of destruction, trauma, and unanswered questions. Welcome to Tales from the Couch. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Tales on the Couch. It's been a few weeks, and I want to start by saying sorry for the unplanned break. I've been battling a leg injury that's kept me off my feet and off the mic too. But I'm healing, feeling better, and excited to be back with you all. And while I was away, something exciting happened. My newest book was released. It's called Messy Mind, Brilliant Life, and it's all about how to make ADHD work for you instead of against you. If you've ever struggled with focus, organization, or rejection sensitivity, this book is for you. I wrote it to be easy to read because, as someone with ADHD myself, I know how tough it can be to stay focused on a book for too long. It's packed with strategies to help you embrace your ADHD and use it to your advantage. So, if you're interested, check it out. It's available on Amazon. A link will be available in the show notes. I'd love to hear your thoughts. But for now, let's dive into today's episode. Today, we're going deep into one of the most disturbing cases in true crime history, Fred and Rosemary West, two names that send chills down the spine of anyone familiar with their crimes. These two weren't just serial killers. They were partners in some of the most horrific acts of violence and abuse ever recorded. Their story is one of deception, manipulation, and pure evil, and it's one that left a permanent scar on England in the 1970s. Let's start at the beginning. Fred West was born in 1941 in a small village in England. By all accounts, his upbringing was deeply disturbing. Stories from his childhood suggest that he was exposed to physical and sexual abuse, and that he later engaged in disturbing behaviors himself. His mother was reportedly overprotective to an unhealthy degree, and Fred himself claimed that incest was common in his home. Now, we can't confirm every detail, but what we do know is that Fred grew up without a clear understanding of boundaries, morality, or human empathy. By his teenage years, he was already showing signs of aggression and a disregard for others. Then there was Rosemary. Rosemary West was born in 1953, over a decade after Fred. Her early life was just as troubled. Her father was violent and strict, with a history of schizophrenia. There were also reports of sexual abuse in her household. She struggled academically and socially, but by the time she met Fred at the age of 15, she seemed to have found her place, at his side. Despite their age difference, the two formed an intense, controlling relationship. Rosemary, much like Fred, was not only drawn to power, but also seemed to crave it. She quickly became the dominant figure in their partnership, and together they created a dark world of abuse, manipulation, and murder. By the early 1970s, Fred and Rosemary West had started their life together in Gloucester, England. Outwardly, they seemed like an ordinary working-class couple. They had children, they rented out rooms, and to the outside world, they were just another family trying to get by. But inside their home at 25 Cromwell Street, something truly nightmarish was happening. Fred and Rosemary began luring in young women, often runaways, hitchhikers, or even their own tenants. Rosemary at times would pose as the friendly face, drawing them in with offers of a warm meal or a place to stay. But once inside, the nightmare would begin. Their victims were tortured, sexually assaulted, and ultimately murdered. And disturbingly, Fred and Rosemary worked together seamlessly, almost as if they thrived on the suffering of others. Many of their victims were buried in the cellar or under the garden of their home, creating what would later be known as the House of Horrors. One of the most gut-wrenching aspects of their crimes, some of their own children were victims. Charmaine West, Fred's stepdaughter from a previous relationship, was just 8 years old when she was murdered. Her crime? She refused to show submission to Rosemary. Anne Marie, another of their daughters, survived but later testified about the horrors she endured. She was sexually abused from a young age, something Fred and Rosemary saw as completely normal. The level of depravity in this case is nearly impossible to comprehend. It wasn't just about murder, it was about control, power, and the pleasure they derived from inflicting pain. One of the biggest questions in this case is how Fred and Rosemary West managed to evade justice for so long. How did they keep their crimes hidden for over 2 decades? One reason: fear and manipulation. They controlled their victims, their children, and even those around them with an iron grip. Neighbors suspected something wasn't right. Strange noises, missing tenants, the general unease around their home. But no one spoke up. Another reason? Lack of police intervention. There were multiple reports of abuse, concerns raised about the children, missing persons reports, but somehow the couple always seemed to slip through the cracks. Authorities at the time failed to connect the dots. For years, the Wests' crimes went unnoticed. The disappearances of their victims were often dismissed as runaways, and despite several reports of abuse in their home, nothing was done. That changed in 1992, when one of their surviving daughters, Louise West, confided in a friend that she and her siblings were being abused. This report led to a social services investigation, which in turn led police to start looking deeper into the West's past. Then came 1994, the year everything unraveled. Police began searching the house and grounds after receiving information about their daughter, Heather West's disappearance. As they dug beneath the home's garden and cellar, they made horrifying discoveries. The remains of multiple young women, many of whom had been missing for decades. The House of Horrors had finally been exposed. Their victims, Charmaine West, age 8, Fred's stepdaughter from his first wife, was murdered in 1971 by Rosemary while Fred was in prison, buried at their previous home. Rena Costello, 27, Fred's first wife, Charmaine's mother, was murdered in 1971 after returning to claim Charmaine. She was strangled and dismembered. Linda Goff, 19, a lodger of the couple, went missing in 1973. Her remains were later found in the cellar. Carol Ann Cooper, 15, a runaway, last seen leaving a cinema and disappeared in 1973, was found buried in the garden. Lucy Partington, 21, a university student and a friend of Fred's niece, went missing in 1973 while traveling home. Her body was found with evidence of torture. Therese Siegenthaler, 21, a Swiss student hitchhiking through the UK, last seen in 1974. Shirley Hubbard, 15, ran away and disappeared in 1974. Juanita Mott, 18, a former lodger at Cromwell Street, had been missing since 1975, was found buried in the garden. Shirley Robinson, 18, lodger, is rumored to have been pregnant by Fred, was murdered in 1977 while she was pregnant. Allison Chambers, 16, was a runaway who disappeared in 1979. Her remains were found in the garden. And lastly, Heather West, 16, Fred and Rosemary's daughter, was murdered in 1987, likely because she threatened to expose them. But remember, it wasn't until 1994 that the police looked into her disappearance, 7 years after she was murdered. The crimes of Fred and Rosemary West spanned over 2 decades, and in that time they tortured, raped, and murdered at least 12 known victims, though the actual number may be higher. Fred West was arrested in February 1994, but before he could face trial, he took the coward's way out, committing suicide in his prison cell on January 1, 1995. His suicide meant he never had to answer for his crimes in court. But Rosemary West stood trial in 1995, facing 10 counts of murder, excluding Fred's first wife, Rena Costello, and Charmaine West, as there was insufficient evidence linking her directly. The trial lasted 7 weeks, and the evidence was overwhelming. Survivors testified about the horrific abuse they endured. Many of their victims endured prolonged torture before being beaten and murdered, including binding and restraints. Victims were often bound with ropes, cords, and handcuffs. Many were gagged with tape to silence their screams. Some victims were discovered with makeshift masks covering their faces, with tubes inserted to control their breathing. Then there's the sexual torture devices, hanging apparatuses. Dildos, vibrators, and other sexual devices were used in their attacks, often as tools of extreme violence. Sharp objects were reportedly inserted into victims. The West's daughter Anne Marie, who survived, testified that she was hung from the ceiling and whipped from an early age. The jury was shown images of these torture devices the West used, and heard recordings of the sadistic conversations between Fred and Rosemary. On November 22, 1995, Rosemary West was convicted of all 10 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole, making her one of the few women in British history to receive a full life sentence. She remains incarcerated at Newhall Prison in England and has never admitted guilt. So what makes a killer couple? How do two people come together and enable each other to commit such heinous crimes? Psychologists believe that in cases like this, there's often a dominant partner and a submissive partner. But in Fred and Rosemary's case, they seem to fuel each other. Fred had an obsession with sexual violence and control, but Rosemary? She seemed to enjoy inflicting pain. She wasn't just an accomplice. She was an active participant, and in many ways, she was even more sadistic than Fred. Together, they created a toxic, violent dynamic where their darkest urges were normalized and encouraged. The partnership allowed them to commit crimes that, perhaps, neither of them would have carried out alone. It's a chilling reminder of what happens when two dangerous minds meet, and how the cycle of abuse, trauma, and unchecked violence can lead to pure evil. The story of Fred and Rosemary West is not just about their crimes. It's about the failures that allowed them to continue for so long. It's about the warning signs that were ignored, the victims who never got justice, and the families left behind in pain. It's also a reminder that abuse and violence often hide in plain sight. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, please don't stay silent. There are people who will listen. There is help. Thank you for joining me for this dark episode of Tales on the Couch. Until next time, take care, be safe, trust your instincts, and as always, stay wise.